Hello, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring a very vast world by just kind of trying to scratch the surface of it. In particular, we're going to be looking at a lot of the effects that drugs have on the communication process of neurons that we've previously discussed. Now, I need to forewarn you that this is a very dense topic and it goes in a number of different directions. We simply don't have time to do that, and it's not necessarily fair because there is such a varying degree of background in medicine and just the kind of basic components of biology from student to student that it really wouldn't serve us well to try to go in nearly as much depth as maybe some other classes would. But hopefully, even though we're going to just be looking at surface topics on this area of drugs in the brain, you can get a lot from it, and it might entice you to take other classes like psychopharmacology classes or potentially drugs in the brain classes if they're offered at this school. This leads me to the very first question we're going to ask today, and that's, well, what defines a drug when talking about drugs and the brain? Well, drugs come in a lot of different forms. Any chemical substance that either injected or ingested or put on the surface of the skin that can interact with the body in a way that alters that bodily functioning is considered a drug. In this class, the drugs that we're going to focus on are what we call psychoactive drugs. And psychoactive drugs are drugs that are specifically designed to impact the functioning of cells within our nervous system, primarily neurons, but there are some psychoactive drugs that can actually impact some of the adjacent kind of structural support cells that are a part of our nervous system. And what we say that they're impacting our nervous system, their impacts are very multifaceted. Most of the time, what we see is that these drugs either enhance the communication of certain cells within our nervous system or they weaken the communication of certain cells within our nervous system. But there are kind of exceptions to that. There are actually a number of hallucinogens that we're going to talk about a little bit later. I don't really do either in a profound way. What they do is kind of just mess with the communication process as a whole, creating these systems where the nervous system gets almost thrown for a loop and the communication process is what we call garbled. So what is it that these drugs are often doing to mess with the communication process? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to this communication that occurs between neurons. If you remember back to our discussion of neuron communication, we spent a lot of time talking about this really important area called the synapse, or sometimes it's called the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft. Right? This synapse is that small microscopic space between two neurons where one neuron, the sending neuron, through its terminal buttons, releases neurotransmitters, and a receiving neuron, through the extensions of its dendrites, has different receptor areas that take in that neurotransmitter to determine if that cell is going to become active or less active as a result of the chemical information it's receiving. Well, what psychoactive drugs all do when either enhancing, decreasing, or garbling this message is they tend to mess with that process, either by creating more neurotransmitter for the sending cell, less receptors areas for the receiving cell, or more receptors areas for the receiving cell, or creating chemicals that mimic some of the neurotransmitters that are out there, or block some of the neurotransmitters that are out there in order to have its robust impact, usually when we're looking at how our nervous system can be impacted by a variety of different psychoactive drugs. But the main thrust of this is that if we're going to see manifestations of these drugs working, we're going to see it in the synapse, and we're going to see some type of alteration in the communication between these cells via the neurotransmitters that are the main catalyst of neuron communication most of the time. So if we want to simplify this even more, we can say that essentially the chemicals that we take that are called psychoactive drugs either are designed to turn more cells on, get them to communicate more, turn more cells in a specific area off, or potentially just keep the lights on or keep those cells on a little bit more. And this brings us to three classifications of drugs, three ways that we kind of categorize drugs. The first category is what we call agonists. These are the drugs, the psychoactive drugs, that are designed to essentially turn more neurons in a specific area on. There's lots of different ways that these agonists work. Again, they can either focus their attention on the sending cell, the receiving cell, or the chemicals that are existing within that synapse, but all agonists have the same goal, to get more cells in certain areas of the brain that are relying on certain types of neurotransmitters to become more active. If we're trying to turn things off, we're looking at what's called antagonists. And again, just like agonists, there's lots of different ways the drugs can do this antagonistic impact or have this antagonistic impact on neurons, but the end result is always the same. If you're taking some type of antagonistic psychoactive drug, what you're going to see is a decreased level of activity of neurons using a specific type of neurotransmitter, hopefully in just specific areas of the brain and the nervous system. But usually what we see, much like with agonists, is that these effects are usually diffused across a number of different areas within our nervous system that are using specific types of neurotransmitters. The last effect that we have where we're keeping things on is what we call a reuptake inhibitor. Now, this particular effect is sort of like an agonistic effect, but people do like to discuss it in kind of a unique way, because what reuptake inhibitors do to create this agonistic effect is not necessarily increase the amount of neurotransmitters in a synapse. They don't necessarily try to get the sending cell to do more or the receiving cell to be more receptive. What they do is prevent this process that we talked about before called reuptake from occurring. And that prevention of reuptake from occurring, even if it's just slowed, can have a pretty profound effect on the communication between cells. Usually when people talk about reuptake inhibitors, they don't talk about recreational drugs, even though there are some that do this. They focus a lot on mental health drugs. One of the common mental health drugs that you'll read about in textbooks and we'll talk about later on are these things called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Drugs that are specifically designed to get to cells that use serotonin in their communication process and prevent them from sucking up the serotonin a little bit faster than it should. Now, this might lead you to ask, well, why would that happen? What would be the advantage of it? And what we see in numerous studies, for an answer, is that this particular process can have a really robust effect on a system within our body called the limbic system, an area that connects the hippocampus, amygdala. There's actually a number of different areas that are attached to it, but those are the two primary ones that you want to know about. And that's because those deal with emotions and memories. The prefrontal cortex is also intertwined with this particular system. And what we see is that when selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are taken, these areas become, for most people, more active. And for people struggling with anxiety issues and depression issues, that increased activity has been reported to be linked to increased moods and just better perceptions of the self. Now, why this is happening is a little bit more tough to untangle, and what happens when these SSRIs are no longer taken is another conversation that goes beyond the scope of what we're going to be looking at here. But just understanding not only kind of what can happen when a psychoactive drug is taken, but what the impacts of those drugs are is something we do want to aim for in this class. So I wanted to mention that one and this particular topic specifically because of the kind of importance of it, that when we look at the history of psychology and how we've looked at the interaction between drugs and the brain. If we go to other classifications of psychoactive drugs, what most people do is focus their attention on what we call the classes of these psychoactive drugs. There's lots of other drugs out there, but to kind of simplify what it is we can look at it in say 30 to 45 minutes, I decided to just focus our attention on 5 major classes of psychoactive drugs that are out there. 4 have been around for a very long period of time in terms of our definitions and our understanding of them. 1 is a relatively newcomer. It's not that the drug hasn't been around for centuries, it's simply that our understanding of it, because of how complex the drug is and how many different things it does, is still not perfectly understood. It's the last drug that you see listed here, marijuana. Now, I promise you we will get to that. I know historically in these classes, this is the #1 thing that students want to learn about and want to debate about, because almost everybody has a strong stance on this particular topic. I promise I will not be trying to tip my hat on where I stand on this topic, primarily because I'm not sure where I stand on this topic. But yeah, I think knowing more about the chemical components to marijuana, what we do and don't know about it, at least what's mostly agreed on. I know many of you will have your own bits of information and knowledge that you're going to try to bring into this, and just please do it cautiously. But understand that, when we get to marijuana, it's much less understood, much less concrete than the 4 other ones, which is why I want to start actually with the first 4 classes of drugs before we get to marijuana. The one we're going to start with is one that actually is pretty easy to break down, even though it seems to kind of have a cascade of different types of effects. And this is this classification of drugs that we call stimulants. Now, stimulants come in a wide variety of forms, and they also come in a wide variety of potencies. Most of us, when we think of stimulants, think of things like cocaine and methamphetamine and other really powerful stimulants that can have not only kind of a momentary impactful effect, but a long-lasting impactful effect because of how they deplete all of the cells that use dopamine and serotonin, and essentially cause the body to start to decay if you're using those drugs way too much. But there are smaller dose stimulants that we're exposed to pretty much every day that most of us don't necessarily recognize are intertwined in terms of how they're chemically working with the body, with cocaine and methamphetamines and other really strong stimulants that are out there. 2 that we are very commonly exposed to are caffeine and nicotine. Cigarettes, not as common anymore these days, but they were significantly more common in the past. And in fact, there are new types of cigarettes, the e-cigarettes, that sometimes have nicotine in them. And those drugs, those chemicals, do again pretty much mimic the effects of cocaine, just to a much lesser extent. Caffeine, same thing. What they all do, and why we put them in the same classification, is they tend to create lots of activity in all of our neurons that use dopamine and serotonin. They are primarily reuptake inhibitors, which means that they prevent all the dopamine and serotonin using drugs from sucking back up the dopamine and serotonin too fast. And in turn, they get greater levels of activity for those drugs that use dopamine and serotonin. What this does to us is it tends to give us an inflated mood, tends to keep our mind racing for a short period of time, but it does also come at a cost. So as we continue to take these drugs and our cells using dopamine and serotonin start to become depleted because they're not getting to recycle that dopamine and serotonin like we spoke about in the last class, now that can impact our ability to pay attention, it can cause confusion, it can cause exhaustion, and because the nervous system is so intertwined with other systems like our circulatory system and our immune system, what we also see is that this robust amount of activity in our nervous system triggers robust amounts of activity in our other systems, and those systems start to become depleted as well. So there's lots of issues with heart problems, lung problems, blood pressure. Essentially, the things extend to a lot of different components of the body when we're taking not just a few stimulants, but an abundance of stimulants. And the impacts of excessive stimulant use has been highlighted in numerous case studies over the years. I don't believe we have images of individuals who used methamphetamine a lot. I think we finally removed it from the slides over the years here. But if you do want to just look up images of people who used large amounts of methamphetamine, you can see how their bodies can rapidly decline in a short period of time. And it's a result of essentially all the cells that were using dopamine and serotonin triggering all of these other body parts to the point where they just can't function the same way anymore. It's a pretty robust effect. This doesn't necessarily happen to the same level with caffeine or nicotine, but it does have some impact on the body, and we are still to this day trying to understand the lasting impacts of, say, drinking 2-3 cups of coffee each day, something that many of us might do to try to kind of stay awake and stay functioning. But we know that there are some pretty nasty side effects to the use of other stimulants, and the assumption is that there's probably some pretty nasty side effects to the continuous use of those stimulants as well. We know that irritability and exhaustion is definitely paired with that, but how it's affecting other parts of the body is still a little bit debated on that particular topic. Now, some of you might be asking yourselves after we've discussed these stimulants, why would somebody use them then? Well, you have to understand that when people are using these chemicals, be it caffeine, nicotine, methamphetamine, cocaine, there's a multitude of effects that these things can impact. The immediate effects tend to be that people who take them feel immediately euphoria. We'll talk a little bit later about why that's the case for almost all of these psychoactive drugs. But they also cause the body to be more stimulated, cause people to be more active, impact people's confidence, and really kind of get people to be more essentially proactive for a period of time while they're taking these drugs. Now, there are other side effects that are going along with it at the time, though. You've got greater confusion, usually delusions kick in, nausea happens as well. So it's not that people are necessarily functioning at a perfect level while they're taking these things, but the positives for many individuals taking these drugs tend to outweigh the negatives while they're taking them. And they do not really think about the long-term effects if excessive use of these drugs continue. Obviously, we've already talked about some of the health issues that come because of the depletion of areas of the body through the use of these. But if you need a reminder, there's a couple reminders here on the bottom of this image highlighting that the consequences of massive amounts of methamphetamine or really any other stimulant use over time. The next classification of drugs that we're going to be talking about are called depressants. Now, depressants, oddly enough, have kind of a counterintuitive name to them. You see the word depressants, you probably automatically think, well, obviously we're looking at we're looking at drugs that are antagonists, right? The name is screaming. These drugs are obviously turning a bunch of stuff off. Well, they are sort of turning a bunch of stuff off. But the way they turn a bunch of stuff off is sort of a complex story. So almost every depressant out there, alcohol kind of in its minor form, heavy tranquilizers, Hypnol, GHB, all of these depressants out there tend to actually do the same thing, and it's actually become agonists for very specific types of neurons and chemicals in our system. What these depressants tend to focus on is a classification of neurons that use a chemical called GABA. These neurons that use GABA are almost always inhibitory neurons. So we talked about the difference between excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So what this kind of classification of drugs does is it floats in our system and it gets all of our inhibitory drugs in a number of different areas to turn off. And that turning off can have a number of different consequences. It can impact our body functioning, it can impact our muscles, it can impact our attention, And it can also impact a lot of our higher order thinking. That's why many people, when they take these depressants, have a lot of their logic thrown out the window, tend to feel much more relaxed, and tend to feel much more kind of impulsive, because a lot of those worries and those thoughts that kind of restrain us go away as a large section of our brain is not entirely shut down, but in essence shut down. Uh, just like we saw with the stimulants earlier, sorry, uh, we can take mild amounts of depressants and it can just have a minor impact on our neurons and our body for a short period of time. Or we can start taking a large number of depressants and we can start to see a really robust effect that can have prolonged effect even after these drugs are no longer in our system. And studying how much depressant we need before we start to see these long-term effects and what is actually impacted by these depressants varies from, I guess, drug to drug in terms of the types of depressants that are out there. But oddly enough, when you kind of hear about depressants, know that almost all of them are actually agonists, not antagonists. And the main thing that they focus on are these inhibitory neurons that are floating, well, not floating, but present throughout your body. The next classification of drugs that we're going to be focusing on are these classifications that we call narcotics. Now, this is kind of a broad term for a number of drugs that fit into this category. And in fact, if we're looking for why we talk about narcotics as this kind of weird categories, because there's actually lots of chemicals, both naturally developed and synthetically developed in our world, that fit into the classification of narcotics. And all of the narcotics out there are kind of chemically designed to do the exact same thing. This is why they fit into this classification. They are agonists, and what they primarily do is they affect endorphins and stimulate large numbers of areas in the brain. If we look at stimulants that we talked about earlier, most of their impacts are on serotonin and dopamine levels. They don't usually go beyond just those two things. Narcotics tend to just try to get the brain functioning more overall as a whole. That's kind of what endorphins do. They're sort of agonists for everything, you could say. I wouldn't say agonists. They're excitatory neurons. They get large numbers of cells to be significantly more active. And what this causes to happen is people tend to feel more warmth and more happiness when they're taking these drugs, but also because you're not just triggering certain areas of the brain, you're triggering large numbers of area, you see kind of the body go into overdrive. So pain, nausea is abated, but also you've got worry, anxiety picking up in lots of individuals. Minds tend to kind of be jumping around. Essentially, with these narcotics, you see this very multifaceted effect that disperses across wide sections of the brain. And it makes it an extremely dicey, tricky topic for scientists to study, because most drugs tend to focus their attentions on just a couple subsets or areas of the brain that primarily use certain types of neurotransmitters. Narcotics just disperse. They kind of go to a large number of areas, and their impacts, because of it, can be multifaceted and sometimes tough to untangle from other things that could be going on in people's lives. There are some pretty amazing effects when it comes to narcotics and the ability to abate pain because of some of the different sections of the body that they actually turn off. But just know that when we're talking about this particular classification of drugs, that is very widespread in terms of its impact and in terms of the kind of long-term consequences if you do start using excessive amounts of narcotics and kind of overstimulating large portions of your brain throughout throughout a large portion of your life. The next classification of drugs that we're going to be looking at is probably just as kind of unusual and odd as narcotics, and it's what we call hallucinogens. Much like narcotics, there's a wide range of different types of hallucinogens that are out there. Some of them have been synthesized, others have been found in the wild. The classic example of hallucinogen found in the wild is something called peyote, which is kind of a plant compound. And what we see with all of these different hallucinogens is that they all seem to have kind of a similar effect on a number of our sensory systems, in particular what we call our projection areas, something we'll be talking about a little bit later, areas of the brain that are designed to process all of the information coming from the cells in our body that are receiving sensory information. Now, how they do this is still a little bit of a mystery slash it's just really darn complex. Some hallucinogens kind of have an agonistic effect primarily, and then some antagonistic effects in other areas. Others have a very strong antagonistic effect and just a little bit of an agonistic effect in other areas. It's kind of confusing as to how this particular process works. And it is complex down to the specific hallucinogen that's out there, but all of them are pretty much designed to do the same thing. They are going to impact different cortical regions of, again, our sensory systems that are primarily dedicated to our sensory systems, be it our occipital lobe, what we sometimes call our visual cortex, our temporal lobe, which is involved in hearing and speech, or our parietal lobe, which is involved in, if you need a reminder, in touch. All three of these systems can be impacted simultaneously, or they can be impacted specifically depending upon the type of hallucinogen we're taking. And oftentimes, a lot of the impacts also work their way up to the frontal cortex, where perception and understanding and levels of consciousness that linked up to dreamlike states that are often reported by people struggling with these hallucinations, taking these hallucinogens, report. And these kind of impacts that these drugs can have on our systems tends to be tied to or tethered to other types of kind of mental experiences. People often report either euphoria or anxiety or issues with just kind of mental functioning as a result of how these hallucinogens are impacting us. But a lot of these side effects seem to be dependent on the types of experiences going on in our other systems that people are kind of impacting through the use of these drugs. One of my favorite ways to kind of highlight how this works is to actually show an old video from the 1950s of one of the first scientific, if we're going to call it scientific studies, to ever examine what LSD does to the brain. This was actually a government-funded study that invited individuals in the community to come in. It had to be people who were not recreational drug users on a regular basis. What they would do is come in, take a very small dose of LSD, and then agreed to be interviewed and filmed to try to determine what the impacts of LSD were, because even to this day, we see there wasn't a lot of understanding of how it impacted people in so many dramatically different ways. One of the kind of classic videos that was created is one that you see linked here on the class slides. I don't think you can access it from these slides, but I will put up a link on the class site, and that way you can watch this really cool historical video that does highlight exactly what LSD use can do to you. But remember, it is kind of an individualized thing, and what's impacted for you can have a pretty dramatic impact on what the, well, not necessarily ulterior, but the additional impacts are on other components to our minds. The last grouping of drugs that we're going to talk about, as I promised, is marijuana. And as I mentioned before, much like hallucinogens, a lot of the other drugs that we've looked at, this particular drug impacts a lot of different things. The issue with marijuana is there's a lot of different strains out there that seem to be designed to activate different components that marijuana can activate. Almost all marijuana contains something called THC, and THC is the primary catalyst that are kind of defining drugs as marijuana. They tend to, if we're looking at THC, be antagonists, essentially turning areas of the brain off. And that antagonistic effect can impact things like anxiety, nausea, pain experiences, and even areas of the brain that seem to be overactive. And this is where people have really tried to argue that marijuana should be legalized and used as a medical treatment. However, it's a complex story as well. So understand that marijuana can do that, but it's also been shown to turn off areas linked to attention and memory and motivation. Essentially, the right combination of chemicals within marijuana can have pretty robust effects for individuals. But like all the drugs that we've talked about, very few drugs just specifically attack the area that we wanted to attack and don't go anywhere else. Marijuana is definitely a drug that fits into that category. So trying to find that happy medium behind using THC to impact pain and nausea and other activities of the brain that we don't want is well, I guess while counterbalancing it with the needs to not create some of the other impacts is a challenge. And it makes this a very difficult topic to discuss in a class like this, if you can't tell already, as I'm stuttering and I'm talking over myself here, because it's a very complex thing and there's a lot of high emotions that tend to be tied to it. So just understand at the chemical level that THC is a pretty amazing antagonist that shuts down a large number of things, and it's been proven to be linked to a vast array of both different problems and mental functions that are critical to our everyday life. So if we want to understand this a little bit more and look at the debate on it, I encourage you to read the books that are out, well, the book that we have for this class, other books that maybe are out there, but just remember that this is always a complex story, and it's tough to definitively state one way or the other whether or not we should be encouraging the use of marijuana, like some people have pushed on communities and other areas. And just to kind of reiterate the complexity of how marijuana works, I did want to include this slide in particular, just so you can see all the different areas that are being inhibited, kind of shut off as a result of marijuana. As you can see, there's a large number of areas that do get impacted by it, and that impact has a lot of consequences. Some of them good, some of them maybe not so good, but it's really tough to specifically state that marijuana should be used for blank, because just like stimulants, just like opiates, just like lots of other drugs that we've talked about, marijuana does not usually just impact one thing. It impacts a lot. And in fact, this, in conjunction with opiates and other drugs that we've talked about earlier, hopefully really highlights that when we're taking these psychoactive drugs, even though we tend to be taking them for a specific reason, most of these drugs are not discriminant. Most of these drugs do not say, okay, I'm going to this area of the brain and impacting these neurons that are using this neurotransmitter. What they tend to do is instead disperse throughout all the different areas of the brain, and any types of cells that are using neurotransmitters that these specific drugs are catered to impact the function of, well, they're impacted. And that means that usually most of the drugs that we take have very multifaceted impacts on the functioning of our nervous system. I think that's probably a good place to close on this topic. just kind of covering the breadth of psychoactive drugs that are out there, at least the categories on it, talking about how their impacts are very multifaceted, sometimes impacting our basic perceptual processes, sometimes impacting moods and memories and other cognitions. And when we look at them, just kind of understanding that they come in varying degrees of potency, their impacts, both in the short term and long term, vary, and kind of the way they interact with the body is very multifaceted. It's a good starting place when talking about drugs and the brain. This is where we're going to close in this intro class, but if you are interested in this topic more, again, please look into some of the other biological classes that we offer, because there are some really interesting avenues that you can go down. And this happens to be an area of interest to you. But we're going to move on now. In our next class, we're going to be talking more about some of the biological functions that are going on. So just be prepared to understand kind of different levels of biological functioning that go beyond just things at the neuron level.